There is a basic assumption most people never stop to question. If a military structure exists, there is a map for it. Not eventually, not unofficially. From the moment construction begins. Underground facilities, in particular, are mapped with extreme discipline. Every turn is measured, every junction labeled, every access point assigned an identifier. During the Cold War, this wasn't optional. In an emergency, orientation mattered more than secrecy. Confusion underground kills faster than exposure. And yet, beneath a U.S. military base in Alaska, there is a tunnel that breaks this rule completely. Not because its map is classified, not because it is heavily redacted, but because, officially, no map exists at all. This tunnel was not hypothetical. It was physically verified. It was engineered, reinforced, maintained, and protected. It had power routing, structural support, and controlled access. It was not folklore. It was not misinterpretation. But when historians and archival researchers later searched for its documentation, they didn't find secrecy. They found absence. No primary schematic, no construction blueprint, no engineering layout, no emergency overlay, no archived diagram, not even a destroyed record. Just a void where a map should have been. That alone would be strange, but it becomes unsettling once you understand how Cold War military documentation actually worked. Infrastructure was never mapped once. It was mapped redundantly. Separate map sets existed for engineers, for command staff, and for long-term archival continuity. Even facilities that were never meant to be publicly acknowledged still produced internal schematics. Those documents might be restricted, but they existed because the system depended on them. A structure without a map is a liability. Maintenance becomes guesswork. Repairs become hazardous. Control becomes unstable. Which makes this tunnel's documentation gap impossible to dismiss as oversight. When researchers examined declassified construction budgets tied to the base, they found clear financial evidence of underground work. Reinforced subgrade passage construction, specialized ventilation routing, structural reinforcement below frost depth. The tunnel was funded, it was planned, it was built. But when those references were followed into the engineering archives, the diagrams were missing. More importantly, the absence wasn't random. Earlier drafts of base paperwork included vague references to underground routing. Later drafts removed the descriptions, but left surrounding sections intact. Final versions removed those sections entirely, creating the impression that nothing had ever existed below ground. This wasn't a lost file. It was a deliberate unthreading. During the Cold War, sensitive records were rarely deleted outright. Deletion created questions. Instead, records were disconnected. File numbers were reassigned. Cross-indexes quietly removed. Microfilm reels mislabeled. Later, digital migrations introduced conversion errors that skipped entire categories without explanation. The process was bureaucratic, quiet, and extremely effective. It followed a simple logic. If a document cannot be found, it cannot be requested. If it cannot be requested, it cannot be challenged. At this point, the question shifts. Not where the map went, but why its absence mattered more than its secrecy. Maps do more than describe space. They make systems understandable. They make movement predictable. They make knowledge transferable. And that may have been the problem. A complete, conventional map would allow someone unfamiliar with the tunnel to navigate it confidently, to understand its layout without instruction, to see how it fit into the base as a whole. So instead of restricting the map, what if the concept of a map was removed entirely? What if access depended on briefing, escort, and memory rather? Then documentation? A structure that exists physically, but not on paper, behaves differently. It becomes harder to explain, harder to challenge, harder to inherit. It can persist quietly, without ever fully entering the record. Which brings us to a far more uncomfortable question. If this tunnel was real, operational, and intentionally unmapped, who was never supposed to find it? And who was trusted to know it without ever writing it down? Before asking why this tunnel had no map, it's important to clarify something most people misunderstand. Military maps are not primarily about navigation. They are about control. In civilian life, maps help people find their way. In military systems, maps define who is allowed to know a space exists, who is allowed to move through it, and under what conditions that movement is permitted. A map is not neutral. It assigns authority. Every Cold War underground map carried more than geometry. It encoded classification levels, access, permissions, routing priorities, and operational assumptions. Certain corridors were drawn clearly. Others were simplified. Some areas were intentionally vague, even on restricted schematics. This wasn't poor drafting. It was behavioral design. If a tunnel was meant for routine use, it appeared clearly. If it was meant for limited use, it appeared partially. If it was meant for exceptional use, it appeared in fragments. But it still appeared. Which is why this tunnel situation stands out. The problem wasn't excessive secrecy. It was structural invisibility. Cold War doctrine relied on underground mapping for three critical reasons. First, orientation under stress. In low-light, high-pressure environments, personnel cannot rely on memory alone. Maps reduce hesitation. Hesitation costs lives. Second, institutional continuity. Personnel rotate, commands change, wars end. Maps ensure that knowledge survives people. Third, containment of responsibility. When something goes wrong, maps define jurisdiction. Who built it? Who maintains it? Who answers for it? A system without a map escapes that chain entirely, and that is rarely accidental. When analysts compared this tunnel to other Cold War underground systems in Alaska and elsewhere, a pattern emerged. Even deeply restricted facilities left behind skeletal documentation, orientation diagrams, partial overlays, emergency schematics. This tunnel left none. So how do you operate an underground system without maps? You don't operate it as infrastructure, you operate it as a procedure. Instead of teaching people to understand a layout, you train them to follow instructions. Instead of orientation, you provide sequences, turn counts, timing rules, access conditions. Spatial understanding is replaced with compliance. This approach is used when knowledge itself is the risk. If someone understands the entire system, they can explain it. If they can explain it, that explanation spreads. Once it spreads, control is lost. But if each person knows only their segment, their door, their route, their timing, no one ever sees the whole. That fragmentation is powerful. It also explains a subtle detail found in surviving paperwork. Maintenance references exist, but they avoid spatial language. Instead of North Corridor or Junction B, they use functional terms: restricted segment, control-adjacent passage, subgrade access route. These are not directions. They are abstractions. Abstractions are harder to visualize, harder to sketch, harder to reconstruct later. Which again suggests intent, because the absence of a map does not make the tunnel unusable. It makes it unexplainable. And that distinction matters. At this point, we have to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if this tunnel was never meant to be inherited? Most military infrastructure, assumes succession, new officers, new administrations, new strategic frameworks. But some systems are built for a single strategic context and become dangerous once that context disappears. A map would allow future analysts to reinterpret purpose, to reclassify function, to ask whether the system should be reused. Removing the map freezes the system in time. It continues to exist physically, but not conceptually. And that leads to a troubling question. If this tunnel's layout was never meant to survive its era, what kind of system remains safe only as long as no one can ever see it whole? By this point, one thing should be clear. The absence of a map was not an accident. It was a choice. But the reason for that choice isn't secrecy in the usual sense. It's something more specific and more fragile. Documentation creates permanence. Once something is fully documented, it becomes legible to people who were never meant to encounter it. Future planners, auditors, analysts, oversight bodies, even well-intentioned successors. And that is where certain Cold War systems became dangerous, because some infrastructure was designed to function only under very narrow assumptions. Assumptions about escalation, about command authority, about how crises would unfold. Those assumptions did not survive the Cold War intact. When they collapsed, the systems built around them didn't automatically become harmless. Some of them became ambiguous, and ambiguity invites reinterpretation. A complete tunnel map would do exactly that. It would invite questions. Why is this passage reinforced beyond standard requirements? Why does it bypass normal access logic? Why does it connect zones that do not align with declared base functions? Those questions are reasonable. They are also destabilizing, because answering them would require explaining the tunnel's original purpose in full. Not just what it was, but why it existed. And that explanation may not have been safe to leave behind. This is the point where the tunnel stops behaving like infrastructure at all. It starts behaving like a liability that must be neutralized without destruction. Cold War planners had several tools for that. They could seal a system permanently. They could collapse it. They could demolish it. All of those options create visible endpoints. They leave evidence. They invite investigation. Removing documentation does the opposite. It preserves the structure while erasing the explanation. That approach is subtle, but effective. A structure without documentation cannot be easily audited. It cannot be confidently reactivated. And most importantly, it cannot be easily justified. If someone encounters it decades later, they face a problem. They know it exists. They don't know what it was for, and they don't know whether activating it would be safe. Uncertainty becomes a break. This may explain why the tunnel was left intact rather than destroyed. Destruction implies finality, but preservation without explanation creates paralysis. There's another reason documentation can become a threat. Maps imply ownership. A mapped tunnel has builders, maintainers, and decision-makers attached to it. Someone is responsible. Someone must answer questions. An unmapped tunnel floats between departments. No single office clearly owns it. No clear chain of accountability exists. If questions arise, the simplest answer becomes, "There's nothing on record." That answer ends most inquiries immediately. This kind of administrative invisibility was not rare during the Cold War. It was used sparingly, but deliberately, when planners wanted a system to persist physically without remaining actionable. Because once documentation disappears, a system becomes difficult to integrate into future planning. New infrastructure routes around it. Modernization plans ignore it. Risk assessments exclude it because it cannot be quantified. It doesn't get activated. It gets avoided. That avoidance is not passive, it is engineered. Which leads to a disturbing implication. If the tunnel's documentation was removed because explanation itself was dangerous, then the original function may have been tied to a doctrine planners later wanted to prevent from resurfacing. Not because it failed, but because it worked, under conditions that no longer exist. And if that's true, the tunnel's silence is not accidental. It is containment. So the question changes again. If documentation was treated as the real threat, what kind of system becomes safer the less anyone understands it? When the Cold War ended, it did not end cleanly. There was no universal shutdown order, no final checklist that neatly decommissioned everything that had been built. Instead, there was drift. Budgets shrank, commands reorganized, threat models changed, and suddenly, systems designed under one worldview were being inherited by people who did not share it. That is, when understanding becomes risky. A future analyst, holding a complete tunnel map, would not see it as its builders did. They would see it through a different lens, one shaped by new doctrines, new priorities, and new assumptions. That reinterpretation is not malicious, but it is unpredictable. A system designed for one strategic moment can become dangerous when repurposed under another. This is why some infrastructure was allowed to fade rather than be explained. Understanding creates options. Options create temptation. Temptation creates misuse. Removing the map removes all three. Without documentation, the tunnel cannot be confidently integrated into new strategic planning. It resists reinterpretation. It remains physically present, but conceptually incomplete. This also explains why later modernization efforts appear to ignore it entirely. When new construction occurred at the base, routing diagrams avoided the tunnel. They built above it, around it, and near it, but never through it. As if planners were instructed not to acknowledge it, not because it was secret in the traditional sense, but because acknowledging it would force explanation, and explanation would reopen questions no one wanted to answer. There is a human dimension to this as well. Military bases rotate personnel constantly. Officers transfer, units redeploy, contractors change. Institutional memory decays quickly. Maps are what survive that turnover. Oral instruction does not. If access to the tunnel depended on briefings, escort procedures, and compartmentalized knowledge, then once those people were gone, the tunnel would effectively disappear, without a single explosive charge being placed. That is a remarkably clean solution. No demolition records, no environmental impact, no oversight hearings, just silence. At that point, the tunnel occupies a strange state, not active, not abandoned, not officially denied, simply undocumented. And undocumented systems behave differently. They cannot be confidently used, they cannot be confidently explained, they cannot be confidently destroyed, they linger. This state may have been intentional, because the most unstable systems are not the ones that fail. They are the ones that still function long after the assumptions behind them have disappeared. Cold War planning relied on rigid escalation logic and centralized authority. Once those conditions dissolved, some systems no longer had a safe interpretive framework. Understanding them fully would invite misuse. So instead, planners appear to have chosen ambiguity. Ambiguity keeps systems dormant. Dormancy keeps them harmless. And that reframes the tunnel entirely. It is not a forgotten artifact. It is a system deliberately left without context, which raises the next unavoidable question. If this tunnel was left unmapped to prevent future reinterpretation, how many other systems were handled the same way, preserved physically, but stripped of explanation, so they could never be confidently used again. At this stage, the tunnel stops being a technical problem. It becomes a human one. Military systems do not disappear on their own. People make decisions about what stays visible, what gets explained, and what is allowed to quietly fade. And fading is not the same as abandonment. Abandonment is formal. It leaves records. It creates dates, signatures, and justifications. Fading does not. Fading happens when responsibility dissolves across time, departments, and personnel rotations. This tunnel shows every sign of having been handled that way. As years passed and Cold War priorities shifted, the people who understood the tunnel's original purpose would have retired, transferred, or moved on. New personnel arrived without full context. Civilian contractors changed. Oversight frameworks evolved. Normally, documentation bridges that gap. But here, documentation was missing. That absence has consequences. Without a map, no one can confidently claim ownership. Without ownership, no one is responsible for explaining the structure. Without explanation, the safest administrative position becomes inaction. This is how systems vanish without being removed. They remain physically present, but administratively invisible. Later, base records hint at this process without ever naming it directly. Tunnel-related maintenance does not fully disappear. Instead, it is absorbed into broader categories: structural stabilization, environmental integrity, foundation monitoring. The work continues. The name does not. Naming creates traceability. Traceability creates accountability. By avoiding both, the tunnel slips into a kind of bureaucratic shadow. There is also a psychological component. People are reluctant to engage deeply with systems they cannot fully explain. A structure that appears on no map, belongs to no department, and carries no clear documentation triggers caution rather than curiosity. No one wants to be the person who activates something they don't understand. So the tunnel is left alone. Over time, that avoidance compounds. New infrastructure is planned without reference to it. Risk assessments exclude it because it cannot be properly modeled. Emergency planning routes around it. Not because it is secret, but because it is undefined. Undefined systems are liabilities. And most organizations minimize liability by ignoring what they cannot categorize. This process is slow, but it is remarkably effective. Decades later, the tunnel still exists, but it no longer fits into any living framework. It is not part of active doctrine. It is not part of modern planning. It is not part of institutional memory. It exists in isolation. That isolation is not accidental. It is the result of a system designed to outlive its explanation without ever forcing a reckoning. Which brings us to an important realization. The tunnel did not need to be destroyed to be neutralized. It only needed to be separated from understanding. Once that separation occurred, the tunnel's future was sealed, not physically, but conceptually. No map, no explanation, no confident use. And that is often enough. So the question is no longer why the tunnel was allowed to fade. The real question is more unsettling. If this was an intentional strategy, what kinds of systems were considered too dangerous to explain, but too important to eliminate outright? Every military system is built with an assumption about time. Some are meant to be used immediately. Some are meant to be inherited. Some are meant to endure. But a few are designed with a different expectation entirely. They are meant to exist without ever being fully revisited. This tunnel appears to be one of them. By removing the map, planners didn't just erase documentation. They altered the tunnel's trajectory. They ensured it would never be confidently understood by anyone outside its original context. A structure with a map invites analysis. Analysis invites reinterpretation. Reinterpretation invites action. A structure without one does the opposite. It discourages engagement. It resists explanation. It remains inert by default. This is why the tunnel was not truly abandoned. It was neutralized without destruction, left intact, left silent, left without context. That silence performs a function. It prevents future decision-makers from confidently activating a system they do not fully understand. It removes the temptation to reuse or repurpose infrastructure built under assumptions that no longer apply. In that sense, the tunnel is not a failure of record-keeping. It is a form of control. Cold War planners were acutely aware that future generations would not share their worldview. They understood that systems designed for binary escalation and rigid command hierarchies could become unstable in a different strategic environment. So instead of leaving behind instructions that might be misused, they left behind ambiguity. Ambiguity is safer than clarity when clarity creates risk. And that reframes the tunnel's legacy. It is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a decision waiting to be respected. The decision was simple: preserve capability without preserving explanation. That choice allowed the structure to fade without controversy, without hearings, without historical reckoning, no official shutdown, no public acknowledgement, no final accounting. Just a system that technically exists, but no longer belongs to anyone. And that is why the tunnel still unsettles people who encounter it. Not because it hides a secret, but because it represents something harder to accept. A reminder that some systems were designed to disappear quietly, not by being destroyed, but by being made impossible to fully understand. If that is true, then this tunnel is not unique. It is an example of how power sometimes chooses silence over explanation, how control can take the form of forgetting, and how some parts of history were engineered not to be remembered clearly at all. Which leaves us with one final question. If this tunnel was allowed to persist without explanation, how many other systems still exist, physically intact, but deliberately stripped of the knowledge needed to ever use them again? That question doesn't end this investigation. It opens the next one. This tunnel does not end with a discovery. It ends with restraint. At some point, the people who built it made a decision, not to erase it, not to explain it, but to let it exist without context. They removed the one thing that would have allowed future generations to fully understand it. The map. Without a map, the tunnel cannot be inherited. Without inheritance, it cannot be confidently used. And without use, it becomes harmless. This was not neglect. It was design. Cold War planners understood that some systems outlive the world they were built for. When that happens, the danger isn't what those systems hide. It's what later generations might try to do with them. So instead of destroying the tunnel, they neutralized it quietly. They preserved the structure while erasing its explanation. They allowed it to fade without forcing a reckoning. What remains isn't a mystery waiting to be solved. It's a reminder. A reminder that power doesn't always operate through action. Sometimes it operates through absence, through silence, through the deliberate decision to leave something behind without telling anyone what it was meant to do. And if that's true, then this tunnel isn't just a leftover from the Cold War. It's evidence of a broader strategy, one where some things were designed to disappear without ever being officially gone.